I'm honored to be here. I've been to Singapore numerous times, and as someone who loves city-states, of course I love Singapore. It is a truly modern city in every way that it develops, the way it works. I think it's a model of its type. I want to thank and congratulate World Architecture for sponsoring this, for Paul Finch, who seems to me to sponsor everything I ever have anything to do with. And I also want to, because I've had the opportunity of staying here where I wouldn't normally, which is in the Marina Bay Sands, say what a fantastic building it is. I mean, a truly, again, modern building of great enjoyment and of great liberation. The idea of having a park on your 50-something floor is really quite fantastic. So it's a good beginning. I'll try not to ruin the rest of the evening. Let me start by saying that this talk will probably go on for a bit more than an hour. So those who want to leave now, you should start. You could also leave later when you get bored. I'm going to talk about a subject I know well and have been working on for many years, which is basic cities. Cities, buildings, public spaces, and people. Cities and citizens. I better know what I'm doing. I've actually called it the compact sustainable city because I think the compact city, which will be my main thesis, is the only sustainable, livable form of city. We very much work in teamwork, and in fact this talk will be a certain amount about the way we live. We as an office of Rogers, Sturck, Harbour and Partners, the idea of the ideas that we try to achieve. We only have one real office in terms of, which is London. We have subsidiary offices, and the whole idea is that we can get the maximum out of those designers. At this moment, of course, Graham Sturck and Ivan Harbour are the primary ones, but there are many others, by always coming back to the home base. A fascinating mixture. I can't quite read those without glasses. I can't read it with glasses. Oh, well, we'll find. Anyhow, this is really, we have a constitution. We're rather unlike, I think, nearly any other office. The constitution creates a framework. This constitution was written some 30 years ago. It's about the type of work we want to do, how we want to do it. It also talks about pay and profit. We gave our office to charity. Charity runs it for us. It's a board made up of 2 external people, 2 internal people. We have the concept of nobody earns more than 8 times the lowest paid architect after 2 years. And the rest of it goes into charity. That charity is basically divided between profit share to all the people in the office, plus to every person in the office has a charity he can give his or a certain amount of money to that charity. It's in a way something about saying we're fortunate, I'm lucky, and we should share that fortune. It's very much about actually the distribution of our wealth, which is the critical problem of today, the lack of distribution of that wealth. So that's what this is about. I shan't go through it. You can read it. I say proudly, I'm a Florentine. I was born in Florence, of Italian parents. I put this Masaccio, perhaps the first great Renaissance painter, up there because it captures the spirit of the city. It's a framework for the meeting of people, for the exchange of ideas. It's an economic framework because, of course, the first city some 6,000 years ago on the Euphrates was about, again, both creating an exchange of goods and exchange of ideas. It's about the poor and the rich, and I'll talk more about that as well. Our concept of cities started, as I said, 6,000 years ago. But perhaps my favorite statement is the famous Greek, when the Hellenic were made citizens. They swore that I will leave this city more beautiful than I entered it. In those days, beauty covered not only aesthetic beauty, but goodness as beauty. And I believe that is, in a sense, our duty. At the end, I'll talk a little bit more, if we have time, about the role of the architect. These are some of the headings I'm going to touch on. Again, I'm not going to read through them. The compact city, which I already mentioned, the movement and public space, retrofitting our cities. I'm very keen on retrofitting. And of course, the old cities. Here in Singapore, one doesn't have this problem, or nowhere near as much. But cities like, let's say, all the British cities, which have great interests, have tremendous areas of brownfield. Their retrofitting is more important, probably, than building. And the principles for sustainable architecture. We've now got to an age where we're driven by, economically and culturally, by the large urban hubs throughout the world. 10% of the population of the world lived in cities 100 years ago. Today it's 50%, and in the next 25, 30 years we'll see 80%. More or less everyone is moving into cities, which is good in terms of climate change and sustainability. Large cities use half the amount of energy that small cities, and as the Sierra Club of America pointed out, that a house built in the countryside to the latest standards, eco standards, uses more energy than a rotten old house in the middle of an old city. That's not so much about heating and cooling, it's about all the other things that have to go with it. First of all, a car, but also schools, hospitals, and so on, which also have to be rebuilt or built somewhere near them. So environmental sustainability is critical to the hubs, and the hubs are now, in my opinion, the principal places, and I hope that we will see a move towards many more, shall we say, Singapore type, we nearly got Scotland type situations where we see cities and nations breaking away and then becoming independent, and now, but within a massive global framework or regional framework. Pienza, one of my favorite cities in Italy, about an hour south of Siena, not quite an hour north of Rome, a city, a medieval city, a truly compact city. You can see that edge, and the beauty about compact cities is it leaves the countryside to the enjoyment of the people. Compact city does not mean you don't have public space. In fact, you have to have more public space if you have greater density. Pienza was a small medieval city. It was taken over by a wonderful pope, and now has a great square in it, a Rossellini Alberti space. And it is a true regeneration of a village. On the right is south of France, but it could be practically anywhere, certainly in Europe, anywhere on the Mediterranean, where we've lost complete control of the city, where everybody goes by car, where nobody knows each other, and it is highly unsustainable. Two diagrams from the Urban Task Force, which I chaired. That was the government's, the Labour Party's government, Tony Blair, Prime Minister, and the Deputy Prime Minister, set up and asked me to chair this organization, which looked at how we could make cities more livable. On the left, your left? No, on your right, sorry. No, left. On the left is the normal city. The blue, the darker the blue, the higher the density, the lighter, obviously the lower the density. There's no neighborhoods, there are no city centers. There is a sort of public transport which doesn't relate to it. It's typical of most cities which are not planned, which we have not thought about. And on the right is the city of districts, of neighborhoods. The city which is related to transportation hubs, related to densities at the center, related to universities, health, and so on, all being within a walkable distance. And a sharp edge where you can get into the countryside when you need to. Some of these are more related to problems we're having in Britain, but they are very much related to many of the problems. Obviously here in Singapore, you don't suffer from brownfield, that is, developments which have gone out of date, which have no longer had to be demolished. But in most of the rest of us, most of it we do. And there's a new craze for new towns. I'll talk about that in a moment. This is a new town in a city. This is King's Cross. You live, work, leisure. It's a true framework. It's got terrific communication. It has lots of public space. It has schools. It has hospitals. It has nearly everything. It's a true new town within a city, which is what I'm going to be talking about quite a bit today. These are successful ones. Barcelona, which has been, what is and has been successful for the last 20 years since the Olympics, which was the whole of the coastline was derelict, totally polluted. You can see it on your left. And on the right is Shanghai, one of the most wonderful coastlines anywhere, with a very high standard of buildings. All the original buildings, and I was advisor to the mayor, both the mayors over the first 15 years after the Olympics. Maragall being perhaps the most key mayor in Europe, the way they selected architects to develop the area, because they didn't have much time, they didn't want to have competitions in those days, they selected the architects that had some form of recognition, gold medals or silver medals or so on. And the standard of architecture is extremely high. And up above there is Germany, Hamburg, another new town, the old port, which is no longer used, which is a wonderful new town. There's an old new town, Notting Hill Gate, tremendously vital, tremendously full of public space. It's strangely enough, and actually Barcelona comes to the same. Notting Hill Gate is about the highest density we have in Britain. Barcelona is the highest density we have in Europe. It doesn't go above 8 stories. So density has little to do with height. It's only when you get to offices that you can get more height, and therefore more dense. New York, that's different because you put it along streets. But in Europe, the highest density is achieved usually between sort of 6 to 8 stories. I'm not against towers, by the way. I'm not against density achieved that way. I'm not against towers for many reasons. I'll talk about that in a moment. On the right is Milton Keynes, a typical new town, very popular now, though as a person who's been through all this before, I keep on pointing it out to the politicians who all want lots more new towns. That we had new town blues, that for many years nobody wanted to go to new towns because, first of all, they're all one class. The poor didn't move to them and the rich didn't move to them. And secondly, there was no juxtaposition between the hundreds of years of history that we benefited from in countries like Britain. So it really was a questionable achievement at one level. And the right hand shows you have to use a car. You don't know your neighbor. This response to Milton Keynes and even more the early new towns, Ebenezer, Howard, were much more logical than they are today. 100 years ago, the average age of living in a city was half that of living in a country. Cities were hellholes. In 1842, the average age of a worker in an industrial city in England, average age of a worker was 17 years old. No wonder everybody wanted to get out, and that's understandable. That is not so now. Therefore, there's no reason in these type of situations. There are some situations where there is a reason for using greenfield or land, but in our situation, sort of Western European industrialized society, American, there's no reason for new towns at the moment, maybe in 20 years' time. Changing to another of the themes that I'm going to talk to you about, apart from the compact city, is movement and public space. In relation to celebration, we celebrate movement. Movement is enjoyable. Movement is what makes cities work, hubs and movement. This is Beaubourg, Centre Pompidou, where instead of going into a lift, elevator, and your head being pressed against somebody you don't know, if you're a small person, into somebody's stomach, you actually look out and you have this great view. Enjoy it. And then, since this is the question, movement is can be a driver of form. In this situation, not only do people form below it and people look down at the circles, people watch people. Really important mantra, people watch people. But also, of course, you're looking out, as you can't see it, to the rest of Paris, and it's a fantastic view. In terms of regeneration and movement, Trafalgar Square, which, if there is a centre of London, there isn't really, because London is unique in being if there is a protection of London, it's the sea, so we don't start from the centre and move outwards. London is really 32 towns in search of a centre, the 32 boroughs, and therefore it's dispersed. But if there was one, it would be Trafalgar Square, and up to, 10 years ago, it was a roundabout. So we had what was once called the heart of an empire, and the heart of an empire was the roundabout, which sort of seemed to be wrong. We did a plan for it and exhibited in the Royal Academy in, I think, in 1986, this is part of it, the one you're seeing now. It was then put into form by Norman Foster, and it is now a fantastic square. The lower one is the north side of the Thames, which we are trying to close and continuously try to close to at least to pedestrianize. After all, cities are for people, they're not specifically for cars. Cars have their advantage in some situations. You want to minimize them if you can. This is a plan, I won't go through in any detail, about beginning to humanize the center of London. The most successful part is the South Bank, which without doubt is the best urban regeneration in London, where people can walk with their parties, where there's a mix of all cultures. But here also you can see Trafalgar Square. We want to do Parliament Square, which we've failed, and so on. It's again, how do you do it step by step? How do you plan for the future to make your city more human? This happens to be Strasbourg, a city where these trams were put in about 15, 20 years ago and have changed the nature of the city. They've freed up whole spaces where you can have squares, where you can have shops, where you can enjoy yourself, where you can get what little sun you can get in Strasbourg. And then Oxford Street, possibly the most successful commercial street in Europe, which is really a mess. And you can see it from this. Now, it is a little bit better, often cheap, because it's slightly old, but it is a mess. And if you look at the left, which it was very much like that in Strasbourg, and look at the right. Again, streets for people. Copenhagen has, first of all, one of the highest livability rates, enjoyability rates anywhere in the world. 1/3 of people in Copenhagen go by bicycle. It takes all the pressure off the transport, by the way, though you have wonderful transport systems here. So most people go by bicycles. They've also gone with the brilliant young girls who's followed, especially Copenhagen, for the last 50 years in film and drawings to make it again more humanistic. So that shows a place where you want to be. In Copenhagen, even in the winter, they give you blankets outside in the cafe so you can sit outside and wrap yourselves up. I mean, this is, and people, as far as I can see, they don't steal them. So this is really about a good life, a human life. On the right is my local high street, Hammersmith. Again, cheating is better than it was when I took that photograph. But you can see why nobody wants to walk down the street like on that. I mean, the only way you can go there is to go into the equivalent of an armored tank and go down the street, because you're so scared that you don't want to go down there. You're closed completely. There's nothing welcoming about that. A couple of figures that interest me. Population using public transport. 81% of the population of Los Angeles uses the car to go to town. Not only do 81%, which means nobody meets anybody, except if they're going to a film premiere, and in fact, Los Angeles is over 60% tarmac, or whatever you call it here, macadam, black stuff on the roads. That is way beyond anywhere else. It's also got more roads than everybody else, and it's got more congestion, which tells you that building roads is not the answer to the problem. Tokyo, same sort of figure. 78% of the population of Tokyo go by public transport. So in one you go by car, and one in public transport. You can do this all over the world. It's interesting, and to see how people have dealt with those problems. Continue with this question of transport, of parking. Parking is actually the scourge. We're building a headquarters for BBVA Bank in Mexico City, fantastic city, of about 100,000 square meters, and it has 3,000 car parks. You can't already go along any road in Mexico City, so we're adding another 300,000. City of London has not allowed car parking with their offices for years. I'm going to guess 30 or 40 years. We've just completed the one on the right, which is called the cheese grater, which leans backwards, and that has Lloyd's on the left. Those two buildings, well, one has 10 car parks, Lloyd's, and the cheese grater, which is the same size as the BBVA, has 15 car parks, only for the disabled. And it works perfectly well here. So it's a question of being decisive about how you control transport. And I've never heard any complaints, by the way, in the City of London, the city that I've lived in for more or less all my life. It has never been an issue. Retrofitting, another point I want to make in terms of the vitality of cities, the vivacity of cities. There are many neighborhoods, many high streets, many local spaces, like this one here, which are very vital, but there would be no great difficulty to densify, to create a better standard of living. So the point again of talking about expanding outwards, let's densify these areas before we move outwards. It's not so much, maybe densify is right, it's intensify would be the right word. To intensify around those hubs. I will be talking a bit about those in London. And there are hundreds of these. And it's easy, if you look at this photograph, you could easily add 100 housing units without any, or apartments, flats, without any difficulty. And there are 600 of these in London, which more or less meets the problems that we have in London. Manchester, the second largest city in Britain, just over 1 million. This is one of the problems of Britain, that is, it's got London, which is booming. It's got about 8 million, growing out a million every 10 years. We'll be probably 10 million within the next 20 years. These cities, like Manchester, have massive areas of dereliction. This is just off the center, to the left, and you'll see a diagram in a moment, is the center. In large part of this area, only 1 out of 5 buildings are actually occupied. The rest are derelict. We're talking about a nation which is the 5th richest nation in the world. So you have to say there's something wrong with the way we deal with buildings. Now, I believe that housing, a roof over your head, should be considered the same as food, as health, as education. It's in the same range. Somehow we believe it's really a manipulation of capital only. So Manchester, which, as I've said before, is a successful city, has these vast areas of dereliction. So people move out towards the countryside, have to buy cars, and so on and so on. This is a diagram we did some years ago with the Urban Task Force, which shows Manchester. This is East Manchester. There's it is in the center. And then these hubs, these neighborhoods and district areas and so on, transportation networks and so on. Now, we are moving towards that. It is more successful. It is better. And last week I attended the Labour Party conference at Manchester. And I think some people I said, look, just look out just walk from the station to the conference and see how much brown field before we build new towns outside. And there is, even in Manchester, the second richest city in Britain, there's a vast amount of derelict land. London has gone through a revolution. In 1980s, when I started building Lloyd's, when I began to get involved in the City of London, the general feeling in the City of London was that London was sort of static, and that Frankfurt would be the next business city of Europe. It would become the hub of Europe. Now, it seems strange to us. I'm nothing against Frankfurt. Anybody who comes from it, I'm sorry. But London has a lot more than Frankfurt has, because it's a real mix. It has everything. Somehow it picked up. And London is extremely exciting. And I would say that today, and we've talked a number of times to planners here and so on, London, together with New York, are the only two global cities. does show you that in 20 years, the whole thing can change over quite quickly. Probably happened in 15 years. Going down the drain, Lloyd's of London were talking about maybe we should have a second headquarters in Frankfurt, getting ready for the debacle in London. Fortunately, they didn't. Fortunately, most people didn't. And London is now amazingly vital. You can get nearly anything in London, from culture to business. Extremely, extremely expensive. Why is it expensive? As we just got to that point. One of the problems is, and this is very much a problem in England, is that whereas the Hamburg, which I showed you, Barcelona, France, Netherlands, etc., basically the councils, elected councils, do the planning, do the basic designs, then go out to contractors, housing contractors and so on to build. We have some funny idea that the answer is, we need housing, therefore let's go straight to the big volume house builders. But the volume house builders, and they would agree, are business people. Their interest is profit. If one house will get a better profit than 100, we'll build one house. If there is a restriction on housing, that pushes the houses up, the costs up, which is what's happened to London. London is now, I read the other day, the most expensive city in the world. This is a problem, a lot to do with residential, a lot of the problems of the way that we have handed over the power of development to house builders rather than, not even to developers, but rather than to the society, which is basically, as I said, the community and therefore the elected body. Oh, sorry, let me get back one. This, I won't stop here except to say this, I worked for over 10 years as a chief advisor to the Mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, and like a year or two with Boris Johnson afterwards. And these were his aims. They were very exciting aims, I thought, dealing with the population, dealing with keeping the green belt. We built well, we built at quite a high rate. We used any greenfield whatsoever. We banned greenfield. Again, the urban task force said, always green before brown, brown being the derelict land. Ken went beyond that, he said, never touch green. And so I won't go through all these figures because you can read them, I think, perfectly well, which is more than where I can't from here. Anyhow. This is a bit of research done looking at London at what we've called localities. Localities are places where 2 or 3 shops, maybe a kindergarten, a health center, a few bits, something creates a nucleus. As I mentioned before, there are 600 of them in London. They are what is the vitality of London. Those places are all within walking distance of housing. You don't ever need a car to go to your nearest locality, which is one of the ways that we defined it. It's an interesting way of looking at a city, which is not only neighborhoods or districts or cities, but right down to what is a locality. This is a bit like the Manchester situation that we haven't built here. This is the Docklands. London was one of the world's greatest ports, was the world's greatest port. Now nobody goes by ship to London because if they're going to go by ship, they'll go off much nearer the coast than London. We also were a massive manufacturing area, especially of cars. All this has gone, leaving behind a vast area of dereliction, of poverty. 3 of the poorest boroughs of districts in Western Europe are here. 3 of the 20 poorest boroughs of the whole of Western Europe are right here in London. London is the richest city, probably, in Europe. It shows, again, an inability to distribute wealth. And the point we're making all the time is fill in these. Start from the center. If you're developing, start from the center and outwards. Start from the hub outwards. Start from the district center outwards. Start from the city center, move outwards. This is a study we made which showed that we could get a vast number of dwellings in that area. Royal Docks, Canary Wharf. The Olympics, a roaring success. In terms of the Olympics, it's opened up a whole area of new housing. It's another new city. Shanghai. We were asked, actually by, I think it was Mitterrand, I guess in the early 80s, to talk to the mayor of Shanghai. There were 6 firms asked. There's a consultation rather than a competition to talk to the mayor about the development of Shanghai. At that point, Shanghai was about 9 million people. It was all bicycles, it was all walking. It was obviously at the beginning of a new era, shall we say, in the sense that things had changed vastly since the dominant communist control. And the mayor wanted to know how to go and what could we do with Pudong. Pudong had no links to Pudong being across the river from the Bund. The Bund is the area on this edge here, which is a wonderful part of the city, of great buildings. And we made some suggestions, produced this plan. By the way, by the time we finished producing the plan, they more or less built the town, nothing to do with what we drew. It was immense speed. And we suggested there should be half a dozen towns or cities along a light railway line, and then connections back to the main city, bridges, subways, etc. These are the 6 hubs, each one just below 200,000 people. And what was also equally interesting was not only there were a series of hubs, and that you could get from each hub, you could get to either the Central Park, which is in the center there, or to the water park and the walker within 10 minutes. But also that you used only a quarter of the energy that you would have done in the traditional development of this site. Now today, with the knowledge we have, and we're talking now about 25 years, if not more, 30 years, we would be able to use much less energy. But it does again show that if you want to use less energy, you can certainly do it through good planning and by, obviously, good construction. So a model of that, a model of Shanghai, of what we built, or what we suggested there. There's a great Central Park. A series of avenues came out of that, and then there's a ring which connected all the hubs. The hubs were about a mile apart from each other. The center of those hubs, but basically along the tramway, along the light railway, were all the higher buildings, and live, work, leisure, which is actually on the right-hand side, which is the different colors, were all mixed into the city. So rather than ghettoize work at one end or live at another end, a real mix. This is how it is now. Now, where we had 9 million people, and if I remember rightly, 7 million bicycles, when we first went there, and I said to the mayor, gosh, you've got 7 million bicycles. And I think he thought that he had a snotty Westerner looking down his nose. He said, don't worry, Mr. Rogers, we will ban bicycles by the end of the century. Luckily, he didn't. Having said that, in a way, he did, because, of course, you can't cycle here any longer. So what was really a city that was doing even better than Copenhagen has now become a city which is basically completely car-led, because there's no feeling, no spirit of communication between individuals any longer. There's no public spaces. It's the death of public spaces, the erosion of public space. Let's touch on a few more before I finish. We are looking at Paris, have been looking at Paris for the president. Paris, again, is a fascinating city, a beautiful city, which is having has had a down period. And looking at what one can do with the transportation, I won't go into detail. One of the things that we found out was that a lot of the people who find themselves in the center of Paris never want in a car or a truck, never wanted to be there, but there was any way of going from A to B was through the center. So that is your circular road of going around it, that's your stops. And then we started looking at what can you do with this massive area when you have big motorways, big trains, and how do you build over those train areas, which is the next section through the next part, and then the greening of Paris along those routes. Talking a moment now about buildings and sustainability. We have always worked towards trying to lower the amount of energy. There's no doubt that climate change is the most serious threat to our society. It's not a threat to the globe. The globe will go on. Just we won't be there. So we are all now trying to do something to improve the quality of life in terms of climate change. This is the back of the Centre Pompidou. The concept, and this is in the days when we knew a lot less than we do now about how to handle it. But the concept was that whatever you did with any forms of energy systems, they would be on the outside and they could be removed, looking towards a future where there would be different types of energy control systems. Now, there was a secondary element in that, and that is it gave light and shadow and form, which is what architecture is, but it also gives color, it gives enjoyment. But we use these elements, and of course, structure on the outside. This is, in fact, the Pompidou. The statement which you read there is the first statement made when we did the competition. There were 700 entries, and ours, strange enough, was the only one which didn't have a large piazza in front, a place for all people, the young and the old, the poor and the rich, all creeds and nationalities, a cross between New York Times Square and London British Museum. So culture and excitement, a fun palace at one level of the thing, but also a place where all people could both study and meet each other. Now, in a way, the piazza has been certainly the most successful place in terms of people who come there. You have musicians, you have poets, you have fire eaters, you have political, and the people look down from that escalator. And what is perhaps the most successful part of Boberg is the fact that the public domain actually goes up the facade. In other words, it's not just the horizontal space, it's actually also up the facade of the building. It's a light structure, it's a light framework. It was done with the Arabs, with the brilliant Peter Rice, who now is dead and who died. This was actually the competition facade. And what is interesting about it, it has the ideas. There's the celebration of movement, the elevators in the center, this light steel framework. But it's quite interesting when one looks back, again, 1970, many, many years, and see how much is a political concept. It's about anti-Vietnam. It's about people coming together. We were then left, when the presidents used to ask us, and who controls the facade, the communication of the facade? And one said, it's all about culture. And people said, is it really? Look at this. Who's controlling the political element? We lost that battle. This is how the area around Centre Pompidou, Beaubourg, was. It was a very poor, it was the brothel area of Paris. It was a parking area since 1931. The parking area had been destroyed or been pulled down. It had been pulled down because it's a brothel area. The idea was the easiest way of getting rid of prostitution is to pull the buildings down, but the prostitutes were clever and moved one street back. And then it became, of course, the Beaubourg, which is this building here. And the concept, again, was a massive flexibility. Big floors, which could be a museum, it could be a hospital, it could be a university. There were big floors, well-serviced big floors, and a great public space. And there you see the concept of the structure moving out. And I put this in a way among cities because it is a small city in its own way. It has this immensely free spaces, the market spaces, if you like, the trading spaces, the cultural spaces, between structures and movement, and the great piazza. I'm a great believer that the form of the building has not only got to relate to the functions, remembering that functions change, that really the only constant, that famous, the only real constant in life is change. And many of us live in warehouses, and warehouses have moved out into other places and so on, but structures stay. So the idea of this framework, this sort of bookshelves, if you like, a very fine framework. That's a cable, this is the end of one of the nodes. That's a 8-ton bracket, water-cooled columns pulling down. And I put that against a French cathedral, Notre Dame in this situation, to say celebration of structure has always been with us. It's not something new. It's one of the ways that we can get scale, one of the ways we can get the play of light and shadow. It's one of the ways which we can get celebration. The construction is imperative. I think, again, architects are losing control. And the last thing I'll say is a little bit about the role of the architects as I see it at the end of this talk. But here you see very much the architect working closely together with the engineer. I mean, you really couldn't divide the line between Renzo Piano and Peter Rice. Yes, Renzo had a better feeling about maybe uses of buildings, but he had a very good feeling about structure. But Peter could do pretty much the same thing. And these are wonderful, you're making with the hands, you're making these amazing pieces. And it's very exciting, it's very exciting to show them, to celebrate them. And the danger, and we have this continuously with clients who say, we only want a sketch. That's the end of architecture, because architecture is about the detail as much as the idea. Transparency, another of our favorite words. The Pompidou Center, the movement system up the escalators, the feeling of transparency of layers upon layer upon layer. The scale of the hand. Cross-bracing the Pompidou, the leaves give you the scale of it, a certain fineness as well as certain heaviness. Lloyd's of London, the client wanted a flexible building. They'd occupied the building four times in about 30 years. They wanted the building to last at least into the next century. We managed to get that far. And one of the ways that we did it was to move again the service cores outside the building so that they could be changed. And the central part of the building was, like Beaubourg, was really a big warehouse. And that, on the right-hand side, it's a medieval city. London is medieval. It's got streets which are irregular, to put it mildly. And so we managed to make a square building and then fill in the spaces with the service cores around the outside. And again, that gives you that dialogue between the solid form at the back and the cores in the front. And there's also a diagram showing longevity of parts. I mean, streets and so on, especially in Europe, are hundreds, well, not only in Europe, in China, they're hundreds of years old. On the other hand, mechanical services, like any bit of machinery, has a very short life. And so you have to think about that if you don't want to demolish the building, and it is not sustainable to continuously demolish buildings. Interior, the views. In a way, if Pompidou Center was very much a container building, this tried to respond much more to the context. It's actually interesting because we did do it. The building slopes down to the low buildings in the back, and it goes up to the high buildings. None of that exists today. All the things that we thought we were taking as points within the environment, which people were saying, oh, how clever, you're actually responding to the environment, not one of them, which makes one think a little bit about how one responds to the local environment. That's the inside of Lloyd's, again, a celebration of movement internally. Again, the piazza. The piazza is not only outside, it's also inside. We have a house where we call our living room the piazza. Everybody marches through it, but it's also a big space. And this, again, is the piazza within Lloyd's. The importance of detail, the points of the grain, of scale, of mass, of the prefabricated toilets. What's interesting when you look at this, and you'll see the building we've just completed, is now this building looks nearly sort of 100 years old in comparison. We started with Chifley, which is Australia. I won't stop here, but it's a building in Australia with a very important public space below it, and spaces all the way up the building. These are the spaces, the courtyards that you go as you go up the building. These are some courts. The main message here is that buildings like courts are not courts, they're not prisons. In the 19th century, we built courts like prisons. Courts are schools for learning about justice. They should be public. People are encouraged to go up those staircases onto those areas. The wooden things are 7 courts. There's the office buildings behind it. And the people are encouraged to, again, to take their children with them, to take their old people with them. So this is a piece of the city. It's in Bordeaux, fantastic city, beautiful city. It gets more beautiful every day. It made its money out of 2 very liberal concepts, slavery and drink. But it is a wonderful city. The interior of the courtrooms, a school in Tokyo near Kyoto, which is also a school. It's a play place during the summer holidays. It's a meeting hall. It's where the city hall itself meets there on certain days. It's a multi-purpose building. Sorry, that's out of place, but that shows summer and winter in the courts in Bordeaux and the way it meets and the need to lower the amount of energy. Madrid, one of the most enjoyable of the buildings we've designed in the last few years, a massive airport, piece of airport, Terminal 4 in Madrid. And here we were trying to capture the spirit of travel. I mean, I think travel is tremendously exciting. It used to be fantastic. You used to go on trains. I can remember it well. And, you know, this mystery about going on train. Here you are, Central Station, New York, great photograph. And one wants to capture some of that excitement of travel. It's not, in a way, when we got the program or brief from our clients, what they really wanted was a shopping center with wings. They were only really interested. They didn't care about flying. They wanted making money out of the shopping center. There has to be more to flying than buying goods. So we wanted to capture that spirit. This was 1.4 kilometers long. It had to have some sort of ownership. And here again, we use color. The same way as we did on the Pompidou Center, where we colored the different ducts and so on as our codes. There's codes in Europe which say basically red is exits and blue is air conditioning and so on. Here instead there wasn't these codes, and so we decided to use the rainbow as our guide. And so really the poetic interpretation of the spirit of travel was that it's more exciting to meet your girlfriend or boyfriend outside the pink column than gate 63. So again, it's about celebration of the spirit of enjoyment. The interior, light everywhere. This is the baggage handling. Usually baggage handling is underground. We brought the light down. A vertical village. There's not much doubt that in sustainability terms, so it has other, vertical movement. It's better to go up an elevator than it is down a street. This is a village. This was in San Francisco. It was not built, but it showed a mixture of university, of market, of buses and transportation, as well as offices and living within a framework. And I mentioned this, you can see Lloyd's, you might be able to see Lloyd's on the left, and then the cheese grater, as it's called. The British taxis have a system in which they nickname buildings. I rather like it. This one is called the cheese grater. It leans back because there's Lloyd's, because there's St. Paul's. On the right-hand side, you can see St. Paul's. You have to give a certain amount of air between St. Paul's. And again, a lot of other buildings in London are controlled by sight lines. There's a sight line there, and the only way you could build a tall building is to slope it backwards, which is what we did there. So constraints, and this is again another of the sort of, shall we say, messages practically, and that is, I believe if you turn constraints upside down, you can get very exciting things happening. So constraint was A, how do you get it out of the way of St. Paul's, and B, what can you do with the ground so that there's not a cigarette box, however beautiful or ugly, sitting on the ground. This continues the concept. There are the elevators or lifts at the back, the spaces in the front, and then you have a tremendous garden in the front itself. The client accepted that the first 7 stories could be a vertical garden, no actual office activities. This is where all well, you can see, first of all, the plan, the mechanical services and the toilets at the back, and a totally free plan in the front, getting smaller as you go upwards. And these are the elevators going up to the 7th floor, and so that it can be a joyful place where people can meet. And then, I think it's lastly, practically, the Welsh Parliament, again, which is very much about designing the building, makes government transparent and maximizes the nature of light and ventilation. And so we call that a democratic roof. We said everybody can go in here, anybody who wants can enjoy it. So people come with their children, with their wheelchairs, and this is all public space, public domain, goes throughout the building. And the courts themselves are below ground. Those big white things, which actually are wooden things now, those things are the way that we cool the big spaces below ground, which is the private and secure areas. But the rest is just for fun, for enjoyment. Diagrams of how you do it, but more important, the right hand shows people looking down at Parliament, sitting. Industrialization of components, housing, prefabrication in Korea. Again, the concept was to create a system, and the client said, I don't want any flexibility, which is the opposite of what we've always done. I just want 2-room flats. I think probably just thinking of China in those days, 15 years ago, never went ahead. And this is very much made like a Model T. The whole thing was made pressed out of steel, from the kitchen units to the beds. Everything was pressed out in one big pressing, highly industrialized system of prefabrication. And there was each unit fitted onto a truck, you can see in the diagram on the right, and they could be piled up. They could either be one-story houses or 40-story towers. And now to finalize this in a way puts together all the urban principles. You know, reclaiming the high street, building mixed use, retrofitting buildings, and protecting the green. These are sort of the key things which we have been discussing. And perhaps last, this is a house we built for my parents in the 60s, and I put it because in much of the DNA of our work comes out of it. Transparency, simple steel structure, a language of structure, single span, total flexibility, a relationship between nature and the building. This has now gone through a number of hands. I have one of my sons now who's a designer who uses this as his office and living areas. But in a way, from here, in the 60s, I would tend to trace much of the work we did since that period. Thank you very much.